has a little vacation home in Colorado. My parents are avid skiers, which was the motivating factor behind that purchase. The home has been in the family since before I was born. It's definitely showing its age in a lot of ways, but it's also like 40 years old. It's not gonna look new. My dad's had to do a lot of upkeep on the place over the years. It's still in our family today, and it's really on its way out at this point. My dad talks about knocking it down and putting up a new place, but I don't really get involved in his decision. This story takes place like 15 years ago, when I was 8 and my brother was 11. We were up in Colorado during a blizzard. The snowfall was insane, and of course, my brother and I had to go out and play in it. The great thing about going up there when we were kids was the sheer amount of space. The property has a huge opening with wood surrounding it in all directions. There's a dead-end road that goes downhill, which leads to a few more almost equally big properties. It's the perfect layout for hide and seek, or snowball fights, or any number of games like that. My brother Josh and I went out in our snow gear to play our snowball fight game with our own little custom rules. Basically, we'd set up the forts. We could pick our forts to be anywhere, but we had to tell each other where we were picking. We would then make one giant snowball as the so-called jewel that we have to successfully steal from the other base and bring back to ours. Josh chose to make his base on the nearest neighboring property. There was almost never a car, like 9 times out of 10, that we'd go there. So we'd often play games on their property too, since they were never there. What we'd do is build little walls to emulate a fort, and then put the big snowball behind the walls. So to get to each other's bases in this game, we could either cut through the woods, or take the road up or down to get to the opposite fort. Once Josh went down the road and disappeared, I was supposed to wait for him to blow the whistle to signal that the game began. I waited for a while, like a long while, over 5 minutes. He had already set up his fort by then, so all he had to do was get back down there and blow the whistle. When it hit around, maybe the 10-minute mark, is when I decided I probably just couldn't hear the whistle from there, so I started plotting my route. Was it better to go through the woods or down the road? I opted for the road because honestly, going through the woods during a blizzard at 8 years old was a scary thought. I started trudging through the unplowed snow on the ground as flakes of snow blew into my face. With the amount of layers my mom made me put on though, I wasn't cold at all. As I approached the driveway to the neighboring property, I looked through the trees and didn't see Josh over there. With all the brush and trees bare in the winter, it was quite easy to see through the woods. So I cut into the property through the trees to kind of sneak in, but Josh was literally nowhere in sight. I saw his fort, so I looked around, and when I could confirm he wasn't anywhere in sight, I approached his fort to grab the jewel. Before I could, I heard a woman's voice yelling out, "Excuse me, are you looking for your brother?" I turned in the direction it came from, and it was an older woman at the front door of the neighbor's house. I called back that we're playing a game. She responded with, "Your brother isn't here." I was very confused. I started walking towards the front steps of the house, and as I got closer, the woman's face got clearer. To my 8-year-old mind, she looked a lot older than she probably was. As I got closer to the house, I noticed at one of the upstairs windows, there was someone looking out at me. For a second, I actually thought it was Josh. It was someone with half their face covered, presumably by a black beanie, and the bottom part of their face covered under the bottom of the window. I also noticed another trail of footprints leading to the front door. They had to be Josh's. The woman was giving me a very creepy smile. I remember that feeling of my heart dropping for some reason. She waved me inside to come in and get out of the cold. I stopped dead in my tracks and screamed, "Josh," but there was no response. The woman stopped smiling. She didn't expect me to do that. I also noticed that the other trail of footprints was doubled over. If it was Josh, his footprints turned around and headed back towards the woods. I then heard heavy footsteps from inside the house. They sounded like they were upstairs coming down. I started to run, and the woman screamed something at me or someone else that I didn't understand. I looked back once at the house, and that face that was upstairs at the window before was no longer there. I ran off the property back on the road, running through my previous footsteps. I started to hear my dad's whistling from up the hill, the whistling he'd do to get my brother and I home at dinner time. When I made it back to our driveway, my dad and Josh were there already, having been on their way to get me. Before I could even try to explain what just happened, Josh was already telling me that there were people in the neighbor's house telling him to come inside. I said the same exact thing happened to me, so my dad went down there with some kind of weapon in his hand while we waited in the home with our mom. He came back after a long while and said that the front door was locked and no one was answering. So we went to another neighbor's house, and they knew the owners of the house and they called them. This part still gives me chills whenever my dad mentions what he was told. The owners of the house were not there that weekend. Nobody was supposed to be in the house. The cops were called and everything, and my brother and I did have to speak to one of the officers on scene to describe the woman. After that, we were no longer involved. According to my dad, the back door was unlocked and the house was investigated, which turned up nothing. For this reason, my parents took home any extra valuable things, in fear of a break-in while we were gone. After that day, we steered clear of playing on that property, just from the creepiness factor of that memory alone. Thank God we didn't go in that house. I've been skiing for as long as I've been able to walk. My parents used to ski competitively. That's actually how they met, so it was really important to them, but my siblings and I learned it as early as possible. Fast forward about 20 odd years, and that's how old I am now. This story happened to me a few winters ago, when I was 21 years old. I was a senior in college. I can't remember for the life of me what mountain we were skiing the trip, as Jaden had booked the whole thing and Rylan was driving. What I do remember was that it was massive, with like 7 ski lifts covering all the different peaks. If I had to guess, it was Killington. We skied nearly 2 full days, and I'm sure there were still trails we missed. That's how big it was. It was the second day, after skiing the day before. We had a pretty good grasp on the trails we enjoyed, so this day would mostly be about testing ourselves and pushing the limits, as per tradition. I'd also be lying if I said we didn't have a handful of fireball shooters to liven things up. We were having an extremely enjoyable trip. The double blacks never got boring, and racing down each slope was its own little game. We had maybe an hour left until the lifts closed. We were all exhausted, but we knew as soon as we hit the road to head home, we'd instantly miss the mountain again. We were contemplating how we would end the trip at the top of the lifts, when 2 girls without their helmets made their way over to us. Now, this might sound a little odd to some people, but I wouldn't be doing this story justice if I left out this detail. The girls, 1 brunette and 1 blonde, were drop dead gorgeous, and I don't say that in any type of strange way. They were just objectively 2 of the most beautiful women I'd ever seen in person. It was disarming. They introduced themselves as Taylor and Devin, and we started making small talk. They basically told us that they were bored because the mountain was full of older folk, which was actually something I had remarked to my friends about the day before. So it made sense why they approached us, a group of young guys that seemed around their age. Devin seemed like a really seasoned skier, as she kept asking Amir all these technical questions about his skis. Him and Rylan actually earned their own expensive skis as opposed to renting like Jaden and I always did, which the girls seemed to be impressed with. Taylor made a comment about our shooters, and we jokingly told them that the alcohol unlocked our true ski potential or something dumb like that, which they found funny. To our surprise, Devin pulled out an unmarked bottle and taunted us, calling us bitches for sticking to a drink as tame as Fireball. The 4 of us welcomed the challenge and happily squeezed some of their bottle, which I could tell sent Rylan a little over the edge. He tends to drink more than he can handle, so this wasn't too surprising. I made a note not to drink too much, because something about this whole situation just rubbed me the wrong way. I still had trouble believing that these 2 girls would want anything to do with some dumb kids like us, especially since we were all wearing helmets and our faces weren't exactly visible. Things were going really well though. Amir was being his usual, overly flirtatious self, but Taylor seemed like she was into it, so I didn't complain. I figured we were just gonna spend the remainder of our time on the slope with these girls, which I didn't really mind too much. Hell, maybe they knew something we could do after the slopes closed. Just then, Devin asked us if we had skied down a trail called Devil's Forest, a name which I definitely didn't recognize. Our other friend Chase would have had the trail map memorized, as he's literally a walking GPS, but he wasn't with us. We told them we hadn't, and they explained that it was a glade trail that's a little obscure and rarely open. For those who don't know, glades are basically trails that extend in between trees, so that you're skiing through a forest. We actually enjoyed skiing glades more than anything else, so this Devil's Forest trail piqued our interest. We told them we were game, and they motioned for us to follow them. We reached a choke point on our skis, and they told us to take them off, because we had to walk slightly uphill for a short while. I could tell we were in a relatively desolate part of the mountain, as the snow was perfectly fresh and there was no one around. The thought of an adventure was kind of invigorating, though, so I thought nothing of it. Drunk and curious, we clipped our skis off and followed the girls up the mountain. Amir and Rylan ran ahead, presumably to flirt some more with them. and Jaden and I hung back a little bit to give them some space. As we followed, I could tell Jaden looked a little wary, so I asked him what was on his mind. I like to think of us as the rational, level-headed ones in the group. Amir was too unpredictable and impulsive, and Rylan would follow a girl if she led him off a cliff. Jaden said that it was weird that the supposed trail would be inaccessible from a ski lift, which I agreed with. I had never had to walk uphill to reach a trail before. We agreed to just keep a keen eye on things. What could the girls do to a group of big guys anyway? They led us into the forest, and the terrain finally started leveling out. Jaden and I caught up with the group, and it was apparent that Rylan and Amir had both made considerable progress. Rylan had his arm around Devin, who was smiling and laughing. They pointed in the same direction we had been traveling, which had all of a sudden become a downward slope. I sighed, knowing this was another instance where we could have used Chase's help. He would have known exactly where we were and where this trail would have led. Jaden was still skeptical and asked the girls if they were sure that this was a real trail. They responded, yes, and told us that it would also take us right back to the lifts. Before I could say anything, Devin pulled the bottle out again and told us we had to finish it. Amir and Rylan happily took some hefty swigs, but when the bottle got around to Jaden, he said he was drunk enough. As soon as he spoke, I could have sworn Devin's smile became a really angry scowl for a split second, but by the time I blinked, she was smiling again. I must have been the only one to notice, because I looked around at my friends, and their expressions were all normal. She put on a seductive smile and batted her eyes at Jaden, asking him nicely. He reluctantly grabbed the bottle. It's just to shut her up. By the time it got to me, I put the bottle up to my mouth, but didn't actually drink. Everything about this encounter was triggering alarm bells suddenly in my head. I handed the bottle back to Devin, who put it away. I noted that neither girl drank this time around. It dawned on me that I hadn't seen either one of them drink anything this whole time. I checked my phone. Half an hour until the lifts closed. I tried to come up with some excuse for why we couldn't ski this trail, saying that we wouldn't have enough time to get back up and down the mountain to where we had parked. The girls insisted that we'd have enough time, and that the lifts were connected on the bottom anyway. Then, without warning, they told us that we were wasting too much time and took off toward the slope, telling us to follow them if we could. Amir and Rylan immediately followed, clearly hoping for a favorable outcome at the bottom. Jaden and I obviously didn't want to, but figured we had no choice but to follow. So that's what we did. I let Jaden lead the way, because, after all, this was still a challenging looking slope, and skiing in the forest is no joke. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but when we made it to the bottom, I was relieved. The four of them were at the bottom of the slope, laughing and flirting like they had been before. Jaden and I caught up with the group, but something was wrong. There wasn't a lift in sight. We were still surrounded by forest on all sides. I sternly asked the girls where the lift was, and they told me to stop worrying and that it was close by. Then, they said they'd take us there in a few minutes. I relaxed a little, assuming that I was worried this whole time about nothing. As I was rubbing my eyes, I heard a distinct thump in the snow. I opened them to see Rylan, who was literally passed out on his back in the snow. The girls laughed, calling him a lightweight, but I could tell it was more serious than that. Before I could even react, Amir slumped over too. I started freaking out, and I rushed over to them, unclipping my skis. I thanked my lucky stars that they seemed to be breathing normally, but I was beyond horrified. Jaden took a step towards the girls, asking them what the hell was going on. They seemed genuinely shocked, saying they have no idea what was wrong. Jaden took another step before he'd passed out in the snow. I stared in shock, still trying to wrap my head around the gravity of the situation. I just couldn't fathom that this was happening to us. My head started spinning, and I was sure that I was next. The girls had stopped pretending by now, and they looked at me like they were waiting for me to pass out. I felt myself getting dizzy, so I sat down in the snow, even though I wanted to stay on my feet. I demanded to know what they had given us. They didn't respond or even move for that matter. I yelled at them over and over again, but they still didn't react. I wanted to get up, but I quite literally couldn't stand. I didn't pass out, though I kept my eyes open the whole time. Eventually, Taylor turned to Devin and said something along the lines of, "He must have not drank enough." She looked more pissed off than anything. Devin cursed before telling Taylor that they had to go. I was still frouncing after unclipping their skis. I watched them take Amir and Rylan's skis before trudging off into the woods. I had to do something, but my body still felt numb. I couldn't just let them walk off with my friend's skis. I knew they wouldn't be able to move that fast, carrying 2 sets of skis each, especially through the snow. Another few minutes passed, and I started to regain control of my body. I stumbled after their tracks in the snow, but it was actually freakish how far they'd gotten, even with all that added weight. Eventually, I turned to bend and saw them in the distance, way ahead of me. I figured as long as I kept them in sight, I'd be able to track them down. I followed for a couple minutes, and that's when things got crazy. The forest gave way to a clearing, which I could see turned into a road. We must have literally been on the opposite side of the ski mountain, which made sense looking back. That's when I noticed the van parked in the distance. I stopped in my tracks at the edge of the woods. The side of the van opened, and for a big-looking dude stepped out to intercept the girls. The girls motioned for the guys to get back in the van, and one of them turned and pointed directly at me. That's when I realized I was in deep, and also felt like an idiot for leaving my helpless friends unconscious in the woods. The guys from inside the van seemed to be debating whether or not they should leave or chase me, and I wasn't waiting another second. I started wobbling back the way I came, knowing I'd be able to find my friends on the account of the tracks I left behind in the snow. I found them, still passed out. I figured Jaden had had the least to drink, so I tried shaking him awake first. After a couple of handfuls of snow to the face, he was awake enough to talk. I told him what had happened. Still in shock, we tried waking Amira and Rylan up, but had no luck. Jaden and I figured we had no better option, and praying those guys didn't decide to track us down, but they never came. I might not be telling this story if they had. We waited about an hour for our friends to wake up, and when they finally did, we told them everything. We had a million questions. Who were those girls? Who were those other guys? What were they going to do to us? It was chilling imagining what could have happened had I not been quick enough to pretend to drink. Best case scenario was that we would have just woken up robbed, but even that would have been horrible. Something tells me that no one would go to those extremes just to rob some broke college-looking kids. Besides, who really keeps valuables on them when skiing? I guess Amir and Rylan's expensive skis were worth stealing, but it still felt like overkill. Plus, how would they have even known that we had expensive skis with us as opposed to renting? Things didn't make sense. Finding the car was hell. Reporting it to the police was hell. The drive back home was hell. The people running the mountains swore they'd identify those people, but we obviously had to get back on the road and couldn't verify that. The police took it a little more seriously and told us we'd be updated should anything come up. I think it even made local news, but it's been years now, and they obviously never found everything. To this day, we have no idea what kind of roofie they even gave us. Nothing online described anything that was so effective so quickly, especially in a moderately small amount. Our best guess was that the substance was a mix of drugs, which makes sense because all my friends were feeling kinda woozy after they woke up. Those girls and whoever else was behind the whole thing were some sick people. I can only hope it was just an elaborate robbery and nothing more sinister. This is gonna sound a little weird, but bear with me. Every winter, my friends Kyle, Ricky, and I have this little tradition of walking out onto this frown-seen lake a few towns over. It's not some grand event or anything. We just do it for fun. There's something about the vibe of being out there on the ice, surrounded by the quiet stillness that feels almost otherworldly. It's just one of those simple things we've always enjoyed. Call us weird, but we can never get enough of the serenity. If you've ever been out in nature by yourself, with the only sound being the gentle patter of snowflakes, you know what I'm talking about. It feels like you've got a piece of nature all to yourself. The photos always turn out great too, which is a huge plus for a couple of edgy guys like us. This happened this past winter. It's April as I'm writing this, so about 4 months ago now. I know what you're probably thinking, but don't worry, none of us fell through the ice. That's not what this story is about. It was snowing pretty heavily that night, which was the main reason we decided to go. It had been consistently below freezing for a couple of weeks too, so we were relatively confident the lake was completely frozen over. I personally take winter over summer any day of the week. I bet all my friends would agree. There are about a million reasons why, but one of them is as simple as the snowfall itself. First of all, it's just pretty. What I like most about it though, is that you'll never find yourself in complete darkness. Even after sunset, the world isn't entirely dark. The light reflecting off the white snow blends day and night, so you're left with this really surreal feeling that doesn't arise from anything else. The moon was also pretty full that night, so that feeling was amplified. Carl was driving that night. He had a pickup that handled pretty well in the snow, so we just played it safe and let him drive, even though Ricky was usually the one who chauffeured us around. The lake itself is surrounded by a thin forest, so we couldn't actually drive all the way to the water's edge. I don't think forest is the right word. It's really just a cluster of sparsely scattered trees, but it's more than enough to prevent a car from driving through. We parked in a nearby lot and got out of the car. It was freezing out. The three of us bundled up and walked toward the lake. I didn't smoke at the time. I still don't, but Ricky and Kyle both do, so they lit a couple of cigarettes as we walked. I think it was after midnight, but I can't say for sure. All I remember is that there wasn't a soul out there. Not an animal, not a person, nothing. No movement whatsoever besides the three of us. We reached the lake, and as we anticipated, it seemed completely freezing over. The three of us were laughing about something stupid when Carl picked up a small boulder and chucked it onto the ice, testing its integrity. It didn't even crack, so we took that as an indication to make our way towards the middle of the lake. We obviously didn't go super far on the ice. That would have been careless, but we did venture a decent ways away from the ledge. We were maybe 100 feet out when something caught our attention. On the far side of the lake, near the edge where the trees bordered the ice, something big and dark was moving. We stopped talking immediately. We just stopped in our tracks, watching. Whatever it was large, hunched over, and moving slowly toward the lake. Finally, we realized what we were looking at. It was a bear. Ricky was the first to say something. He whispered, "Is that a bear?" as quietly as he could. I didn't answer. My heart was already racing. If it was a bear, the last thing we wanted to do was draw its attention. We stood there, frowning, not even daring to breathe too loudly. But then, as the figure moved closer, something fell off. The way it walked wasn't quite right, too upright, too human. It also looked like there was something dragging behind it. Nothing about it made sense. It was one of the most bizarre things I'd ever seen. And that's when it straightened up completely, and we realized the truth all at once. It wasn't a bear. It was a person. A person wearing some kind of bear suit. Carl said what the hell in a low voice. And I was thinking the same exact thing. I know it doesn't sound scary in a generic sense, but if you had been there, you would have been terrified too. I tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. I don't know if I was more afraid or confused, but something told me to stay quiet. The figure kept moving toward the ice, dragging something behind him. At first, it was hard to tell what it was. The snow blurred the details, but as he got closer, I realized he was holding a rope that was attached to the thing he was dragging. And a few moments later, we could see it more clearly. It was a small black bag. It looked like a smaller sized garbage bag, if they even made those. Either way, it was chilling. We stood there, unsure of what to do. My mind was screaming at me to turn around and leave, but my body felt paralyzed. I couldn't move. I don't think Ricky and Carl were too keen on turning around and leaving either, because neither one of them flinched. I probably wouldn't have left right then, even if I hadn't been so scared. I needed to know what that person was doing. And then, as if the situation couldn't get any stranger, the man unzipped and stepped out of the bear suit. Seeing him as a person didn't make things any better. He wasn't particularly large or intimidating, but there was something unsettling about him. We watched as he bent down, presumably to pick up a rock, but I couldn't tell from so far away. And then the sound started. He knelt down, holding what looked like a rock, and began repeatedly slamming it into the ice. It might have been placebo, but I swear I could feel the vibration in the ice even from the distance. He was trying to break through, most likely to dispose of whatever was in that bag. Ricky tapped my shoulder, and I turned to see him and Carl moving back towards solid ground. Without a word, I followed suit, and the three of us tried to move quickly without making too much noise. Every step felt deafening in the quiet, even though I knew there was no way that guy could hear the crunch of snow from that far away. We'd barely made it a few yards when a voice yelled out, "Hey," from behind us. I didn't even look back. I just started running, praying that guy didn't have a gun. The cold didn't help. I found myself starting to get winded after not even a minute of running. I don't know if he followed. I don't think he did. But in that moment, we were in full-on panic mode. We reached the edge of the lake, and at that point, I was gasping for breath. After a very short break, we made our way back to the car silently, and Carl drove off immediately. None of us had any idea what we had just seen. Carl said it was probably someone dumping their trash, but I told him that was ridiculous. Who in their right mind would dress up in a bear suit in the middle of the winter to legally dump their trash? There was no way. Ricky said it was definitely someone dumping a body, but I told him the bag was way too small for that. The three of us talked about it the whole ride home, but we couldn't agree on a definite explanation. We never got an answer. The reason I'm thinking about this now is because my mom was watching TV the other day, and an old missing persons report popped up on the screen. It was a child from around our area, and the timeline of his disappearance matched up pretty closely with what we had seen on that lake. I'm not jumping to conclusions. I know it's a long shot, and probably just an unfortunate coincidence, but I can't help but wonder if those two things are somehow related. By the time you're hearing this, we've probably reported our sighting to the police. I used to deliver on a paper route when I was 13. It was that sort of old school route where I'd hustle every morning around 6 a.m. with a satchel, dropping off the daily paper to houses. It was a pretty cool gig, simple and pretty much exactly what you'd expect. The one lame part about the job was that it was rain or shine, no matter the weather. Even if it was pitch black with a blizzard, the paper was getting delivered. That's probably why they used to hire kids back in the day. It was easier to pressure them to go, and they had to walk that route either way. One day I was dropping off papers as usual in the morning. It was winter and still dark. These were my favorite shifts, because it felt like the whole world hadn't quite turned on yet. It was cool seeing all the homes nice and county, maybe a wisp or two of smoke still escaping the chimneys. It's just nostalgic for no reason, maybe because of the holidays. I slogged on through the dark. The few street lights that guided my route cast dim yellow glares into the snow drifts beneath them. I remember being extra still and ominous. I would periodically stop between houses to catch my breath, but it was really to survey the neighborhood. I still can't put my finger on it, even to this day, but I remember just feeling weird that morning. Something was off, but not anything I was aware of. All I could do was push on through the cold and get the job done. Shortly after passing a house, at the end of a cul-de-sac, I heard two loud pops, followed by a third a minute later. I grew up around guns and knew that sound, but I just carried on with my route. I figured it was someone getting their car started and the exhaust backfired or something. I'd seen that happen to my dad's truck before, and other cars around town, so I knew it was a possibility. In my 13-year-old brain, it was way more likely than 3 consecutive gunshots. I waited to say anything to anyone until later on that morning. It's just one of those things you don't want to mention, because you don't know the gravity of the situation. When I mentioned what I'd heard, my parents immediately told me that it was all in my head. It probably was just a car backfiring. It did put me at ease, and I just went on with my day. That confirmed what I was so desperate to believe. Later that morning, my neighborhood was full of police and news vans, centered around the house. They were clamoring for neighbors or anyone who'd been around the cul-de-sac that morning. My parents told me to stay inside, but the truth is that I would have never gone to speak to them. Just like when I hesitated to tell my parents, I felt like I was doing something awful. When I told them about what I heard, it felt disrespectful, strange, and very ominous. I felt wrong. I didn't know every single neighbor that we had at the time, but if any of them were dead, I wouldn't have the stomach to hear the news. That was a heavy realization too, but the paper we knew first. Maybe that is why I hesitated. I would be speaking about people I didn't know at all, and it felt very sad to me. You may be able to tell this story. Gave me a lifetime of very quiet, suffocating PTSD. We got the full story as it was pieced together throughout the week. The man who lived in the house was older, at least older than my dad, and had been at local for a very long time. He had a son who was in the army and had been away for some time. He went through a deployment of some kind. I don't know the exact military details, but he eventually came home to visit his father. When he arrived back at home, he wasn't alone. He brought another guy with him, and then proceeded to come out to his father as gay. The other guy was his boyfriend. No one really knew any of the details beyond that, other than how the visit concluded. The dad shot and killed them both that morning, and immediately turned the gun on himself. This is all speculation, but I imagine it was a cold visit for them. Even colder with a half-foot of snow, burying the house and clogging up the streets. It was probably the morning they were planning on heading back to the base, or wherever they lived, and the father just couldn't take it. He couldn't leave them like that. It's a tragedy, and it impacted the entire community, but no one more than me. I didn't deliver another paper for a while. Everyone was pretty understanding as to why, even the newspaper editor. The talk of the town, but for me, it was a memory. It's like I was the fourth man in the room when it happened or something. Be good to yourselves out there. I was driving home with my family after visiting my sister who lives the town over. I was learning how to drive and had a pretty good handle on it. My stepdad let me drive there to get used to winter highway driving, so naturally, I drove back as well. The storm wasn't supposed to start until later that evening, so we thought we would be fine. The trip turned out okay, but I really don't know what anyone was thinking when they let me drive. I had literally no experience behind the wheel, and here we are barreling down a highway with a pending snowburst. At the time, We were joking about how this would be the last trip we'd ever take. It started snowing when we left, which wasn't terrible, because I was capable of driving in the snow, but it picked up fast. We had just left town. We were maybe 10 minutes into the drive before it came a complete whiteout. I'm driving in the left lane. It's 8 p.m. in the middle of January, so it's pitch black in peak winter where I live. The falling snow is blinding. It wasn't like going light speed. Watching all the snow drift by on the windshield, there were so many flakes spilling the glass, and with the headlights bouncing off them, I couldn't see anything at all. It was caking up along the edges of the visor by the inch. Not to mention these are Canadian highways. The only lights you're getting for a long stretch are going to be your headlights. I was doing my absolute best not to panic. I was shocked at the level of calm I was able to muster. My stepdad was doing his best to guide me and try to find a safe place to pull over, but the winds were blowing snow everywhere, so we couldn't see the ditches with the lines. I had two worries. One, I'm in the left lane, so if I pull over, I might not know how far exactly to go and might throw us into a ditch that's completely filled with snow. Two, I can't see the lines at all, and if I keep driving, I might not stay in the correct lane because of that. The only thing I could do is keep driving until I was absolutely certain it was safe to pull over. I was using the rumble strips as my only guide. Since the tires were able to get to a slight feel for them, I was doing something like maybe 45 in a 75. My stepdad is guiding me to the road his parents live on, so we can't have a better place to stop. We passed maybe 8 cars in the ditch between my sister's town and my grandparents' road. My speed only descended from there, as the storm didn't let up. The sky only seemed to get darker, and as the snow started to freeze along the highways, the tires started to spin a little. The faster I went, the less control I had of the car. At some point, the road was completely covered, and the rumble strips weren't noticeable anymore either, so I was just going off instinct. I ended up hitting a sheet of ice at an awkward angle and spun out into the oncoming lane. I managed to regain control of the car, saw faint headlights, and said, "Yep, we're in the wrong lane. Shouldn't be here at all." Thankfully and quickly, I safely moved us back over into the proper lane. My mom's in the back seat freaking the fuck out because we just spun out, and now I'm making the decisions behind the wheel. It's not like she can crawl up into the driver's seat and just take over. Somehow, my stepdad is surprisingly less chill than me, but trying to keep his cool, doing everything he can not to grab the wheel in a panic. I can barely see an inch from the front of the car. Finally, we managed to get to his parents' road and pull over. We got out and switched places, and when I stepped out of the vehicle, the snow was up to my shins. Ended up staying the night at my grandparents' house, because there was no way in hell we were making it back home alive even if we tried. Found out about 15 minutes after getting in that they closed off the highway due to poor conditions. We had to dig our way out of the house the next morning to go home. I got to stay home from school that day, since I was stuck out of town. Meanwhile, everyone else had to go in. It was my first winter with my learners, and my first blizzard drive. If we had a smaller car, we would have never made it to my grandparents to begin with. I was terrified, but I was not going to let my parents know that, especially with my mom in the back seat very scared. I never should have driven that night, but it helped me learn how to handle those kind of drives later on, and I became a better driver because of it. It was a fucking trip though, that's for sure, and I'll never forget it. I live on an island in Maine that's an hour ferry ride out from civilization. The boat comes 3 days a week typically, but there's a lot of times they cancel due to the weather. It's a very mild trip, not much to talk about aside from the very nice views that you get on both shores. It's the type of stereotype from a Stephen King novel. Isolated, watery depths, little quaint townships. It's cute, but for certain lifestyles, it can be pretty inconvenient. One winter, my best friend was having a bachelor party weekend that I couldn't miss. It wasn't an option. We were getting together for unspeakable debauchery, the kind of shit you only see in movies. Now it's Maine in the middle of January. There's mountains of snow and violent wind swells, but my car time is limited. It's the boat and the plane that I'm worried about. When I check both statuses, they're green. Everyone is operating as normal. I load my bags and navigate the icy roadways and pay the parking fee. Just took one look at the white caps. It has me scratching my head. Did I read the status wrong? There's no way a ferry is working in these conditions. But lo and behold, the status held up. It was still green on the website. The person that I called confirmed that it's green. I could actually see the ferry returning from its previous trip. It rocked a bit on the roaring froth, but actually serves to calm my nerves. Didn't seem to be as affected as I thought it would be. I'm not a sea captain, Sue me, the people arriving are floated and seemed to be in good spirits from what I could see. I made sure to scan them for their reactions: ghost white faces, big buggy eyes, clenched fists, or over-emotional. No one seemed disturbed by their voyage. I doubled down and boarded the moment I was able to. Again, missing this bachelor weekend event was not an option. I drowned in the depths of the ocean before that happened. Needless to say, that damn captain should have cancelled that day. We parted from the port and cruised uneventfully. There wasn't very many of us on board. I played on my phone while others made casual small talk. People going to the mainland for events like me, others for grocery trips and supplies. As we all collectively settled in, the ferry tipping back and forth, it tips one direction a little too far. Everyone gets quiet as they notice it, and it goes back in the other direction and has the same effect. We're starting to rock. Being in the viewing windows, I can see a towering white cap colliding out in front of us. The water is beginning to lap over the sides of the boat. It's a complete whiteout in all directions, and land is nowhere to be seen. The captain makes an announcement over the comm system that things are rougher than normal, but assured us everything was fine. He insisted we all stay calm, stay alert, and put our faith in him. He also said we needed to stay seated. That last part deflated a bit of the morale from us, as we were watching the swells jump over the sides of the boat, some of them easily over 6 feet, strike what I said earlier. Thank God I'm not a sea captain. We did the back and forth, rocking for the rest of the trip, dipping a little more each time. The waves tossed us in any direction they pleased. During one teeter, the pressure from the water sent a huge crack through one of the viewing windows. All of those passengers had to evacuate to other seats, but they had to time their movements with the rocking of the ship. The first people that got up in a panic were thrown to the floor so hard it knocked the wind out of them. They waited for the boat to tip that other way, and then bolted for a different seat. The crack continued to get worse, but the windows never gave in. The staff promised that it was a tempered glass with double pane. They went so far to say that it could stop a low-caliber bullet. I looked at the ferocious ocean beyond the glass and laughed at them. Who cares if it can't stop at A-22? Can't it dam up the Atlantic? No, that glass was nothing in comparison. I guess looking back, maybe the crew was just as shocked and needed to tell themselves something for comfort. It didn't end though. The captain said we were lagging a bit but still making good time, which no one reacted. We were too busy, trying not to vomit on each other from the nauseating voyage. I started to doubt the legendary bachelor party and regretted tempting Mother Nature. She didn't care if she did anything. She left me. The boat rocked again. This time, it tipped so far that I had to put my foot on the wall next to me to stop myself from falling into it. The wall became the floor, and then the floor became a wall. Fortunately, I sat a day solo at the start of the trip, and no one had gotten close to me during the foyer. No one came crashing down on me from further up the row. I imagined if there had been, well, anything to toss about, carts, luggage, whatever, and it would have been like getting stoned to death every time the ferry shifted. It started to clear up after that, and thankfully so, because we couldn't have handled much more back there. We were inches from being tossed right through those windows and into the frigid waters beneath them. It would have been worse than anything I could imagine. The glass would absolutely annihilate our bodies as we passed through it, and the sucking vacuum of the ocean would have ripped us through the froth and debris into raging currents. After that, who knows? Drowning in water so cold it feels like ice cubes in your lungs, having every bone broken by the force of waves, and outright freezing to death. The possibilities were bleak, but never came to fruition. We made it ashore, docked, and I even made my flight on time. The journey was almost as bad, but that's a story for another time. This happened when I was 15, near Algonquin Park. My father and I were driving up to our cottage in the middle of winter. I was always so amazed by the beauty of the park, and had grown up enjoying the beauty of it every single summer. The cottage was on a large lake, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. There were probably thousands of cottages on the lake during the summer. The lake and the town's population tripled. It was cottage country, so people would spend all summer enjoying the lake and warm nights around the campfires with their family and friends. I spent every summer out there growing up. It still brings fond memories of sunshine, laughter, and the sounds of motorboats on the lake. But the winters are different. The people that didn't live there year-round would venture back home to the city life, leaving the area mostly deserted, with cottages boarded up for the winter. There were a few people that still frequently would come up every couple of months for a few days or so. But for the most part, the lake was silent during the winters, and the town was just filled with the locals. The beautiful pine trees, are always covered with snow, making the forest quiet. Our cottage was on a dead-end road. There was about 20 other cottages on the road, with ours being somewhat in the middle. The cottages were quite spaced out, however, with our closest neighbors being too far away to see through the trees. My dad needed to head up to the cottage to do some painting that my mom had been bugging him to do. This was at the end of February, so it was a long weekend. I tagged along so he wouldn't be alone, and we could spend some quality time together. It was about a 5-hour drive from home. It turned out to be an 8-hour drive due to the heavy snow. It had gotten dark out quite early. It was around midnight as we drove through the park. It was deadly quiet and pitch black except for the headlights of the car. We finally passed through the park, with only 30 minutes left to get to the cottage. It stopped snowing, and we were both eager to get there. As we turned onto the familiar road, I remember my dad cursing. It hadn't been plowed yet. This wasn't surprising, however. It probably wouldn't be later until the day when we would even see a snow plow. As we drove down the road, I noticed there was a fresh set of tire tracks. The Smiths must be out for the weekend, my dad had said, all of a sudden, as we drove around the bend, following the tire tracks. The headlights of a car shone on our white van that was parked on the side of the road. It was almost hidden by the vast trees that were covered with snow. What my dad mumbled as we drove past that white van. I remember looking back through the back window and very clearly seeing the figures in the front seat, illuminated by our retreating taillights. I told my dad this, and he shrugged. Maybe they're lost. I nodded, but couldn't help to think about how it was a dead-end road. Why would they feel the need to park right there? As we pulled into our driveway and started bringing our stuff in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't stop thinking about the van and why it was there, with two people just sitting in the dark in the middle of the night. It spooked me so much that I begged my dad to let me sleep upstairs with him instead of downstairs in the room my sister and I usually shared. It had big windows with no blinds that looked out into the blackness of that forest, and my 15-year-old self was already scared of the dark, even without seeing that white van. It wasn't that big of a deal when my sister was there, but not tonight. As my dad got ready for bed, I sat all day in the living room reading a book. My dad had turned off all the lights. I was just using a small lamp next to the couch to try to get through one last chapter before I went to bed. It was so quiet that I could almost hear my ears ringing. I also started to get the feeling that I was being watched. The living room had 2 large windows, again with no curtains, that overlooked the lake. It was black, except for our light from the cottages across the lake. I shut off the lamp and got up. Now that cottage was dark, the moon was shining brightly, illuminating the snow. It was beautiful. I walked toward the window to get a better look. Movement caught my eye, and I remember my heart dropping as I saw the figures down by the back porch below the window, barely hidden by the surrounding trees. I immediately dropped to the floor and crawled towards the bedroom where my dad was. He was sleeping. My heart was in my throat. I wasn't sure if they'd seen me or not yet. I woke my dad, and by the time he got to the window, the figures were gone. Where I had seen those figures, 2 sets of footprints were in the snow that led back to the front of the cottage and then back down the driveway. I begged my dad not to go outside. He double-checked the locks and turned on the porch lights, hopefully to scare any of them off. My dad wasn't as freaked as I was, but still set the alarm before he headed back to bed. I remember being very freaked out, and I lay there all night next to my dad, terrified I'd look out the window and see someone staring right back at me. The next morning, my dad went outside and confirmed. There were 2 sets of footprints leading from the road behind our cottage, and then back around the front of the cottage and then back up to the road. There were tire marks that showed the vehicle had turned around, then got back up to the main road. My dad guessed they were probably looking to break in and steal stuff, as it was the middle of winter, and not too many people were up at the lake, but they knew we were there. They would have seen our tire tracks leading to our cottage, and my dad's car parked out front. They also had to have seen the lamp I turned on to read, and or seen it go off. My dad didn't have an answer to any of this, and after much back and forth, he called the non-emergency line and reported it. Apparently, there had been some break-ins in the area, and some stuff had been stolen from other cottages that were boarded up for the winter. But again, I still wonder to this day, why would they be interested in stealing from a house that clearly had people still inside? I was driving up to a ski hill after a snowstorm. Not having a great amount of money at the time, I hadn't invested in winter tires. Anyone who lives in a snowy region knows the value of these things. They can get an average vehicle out of a less than desirable situation. They aren't going to get you anywhere. but they'll keep you out of the ditches if you're careful. There's a tractor trailer in front of me, a car to my left, and another car behind. This is almost the worst place a driver can be during snowy driving. My car was at the nexus of any trouble that was going to happen, so I did my best to stay sharp and focused. After a while, though, I started to zone out. It's natural for us once we get relaxed and comfortable. Nothing chaotic had happened for a good 20 minutes or so. I just chilled out like anyone does as they're driving. Something shifted in the passenger seat, so I took my eyes off the road for a moment. I'm talking about a split-second correction. I didn't even have to reach over or move anything. It didn't matter. Snow is merciless. Without the snow tires, my bold little city slickers were out of control. Instantly, I'd only made it as far as I did because I was following the trailer tracks in front of me. Just the faintest amount of slush sent me sailing over a crash course for a certain depth. The right wheels crossed over into the shoulder and lost traction. The car drifted to the right, onto the shoulder. I was hoping this would be the end of the situation, crash into the guardrail, sustain some body damage, and get my dumbass back on the road. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than spinning out. I took my foot off the gas and just tried to coast. No brakes, just open steering. Applying either pedal would have contributed to the chaos and lack of control, sending me into a collision at a faster speed. I would have gone into that guardrail, but the snow had piled up against it, forming a natural curve that my car bounced off of. I stared in pure shock and terror as the visuals before me started to turn the other direction. I passed through those tracks that I was following, but I didn't have the reaction time to pull out of the slide. Between my lack of reacting and the impact of the snow drift, my car, still without proper traction, started naturally drifting left. The truck ahead of me began to slow, but I didn't want to brake for fear of losing what traction I had. Now, there's the option of potentially slamming into the back of his trailer, going through the windshield, and maybe even getting decapitated. So my car makes its way sideways across the lane, and I prepare for whatever is going to happen. When I sideswiped the vehicle one lane over, we didn't make contact, but I cut sharply into his lane before slaying back into mine. We came within inches of touching fenders, but he had a more equipped rig and was able to maneuver away from me. The humiliation of almost killing a stranger, and maybe even his family, brought me back into the moment. Just as I hit the center of the lane, my tires managed to grip the road again, and I resumed moving straight forward, tapping my brakes at this point to prevent myself from rear-ending the truck, which was now right in my face. The car seems to be under my control again, and even resumes accelerating through the snow. It feels like an eternity typing it all out like this, but the whole event couldn't have taken more than a few seconds. Car collisions have an uncanny way of dilating time and stretching events out into the longest possible form. It has something to do with a real-time reaction to those events as they happen, and watching them either improve or worsen in rapid fashion. In the end, the only thing that my car made contact with other than the road was that snowbank, and that didn't even leave a mark. I escaped very, very luckily, and was grateful as I could be. It really could have gone south, not just for me, but for those other drivers. Had I killed someone else, it would have affected me forever. And yes, when I got home from the ski hill, I bought myself some snow tires, and haven't gone without them since that trip. I didn't live there, but I spent 2 months helping my grandfather shut up his second farm. He was selling the buildings and most of the land to live full-time on his bigger farm up in Maine. They knew I needed work, and I went immediately from Baltimore up to them. In my shitty Ford Focus, the work itself was lax, but tedious to start, mostly moving animals and their food. Loading up trailer after trailer of chickens, pigs, cows, and one load of even horses. This was my first job in a world with livestock, and I was glad to be back tending to them. There's just something cool about working with animals. You get to know their personalities and quirks, and they can never talk shit to you. It's a rewarding exchange, and it's always rewarding at the end of a day, knowing they're all cared for. So flash forward about a month. We've moved most of the animals, thankfully. When a huge blizzard hit, it wasn't just the blizzard, though. His property rests at the bottom of a soft 2-mile slope. And by soft, I mean a gentle slope that very gradually declines until it reaches his property. In snow country, these types of terrain features are the worst. The snow cascades down the hillside in sheets until there isn't enough to slide anymore. The drifts were 20 feet high in some spots. To give you a picture, the snow was as tall as 2 outlying barns, and far taller than any of the stables or coops. We were using barrels burning wood and tires to keep the area between the house and barn clear. There would be a blazing barrel every 8 feet or so, and we had to keep them going because they were impossible to restart. If the snow got in and doused it, the whole barrel had to be replaced. Rolling around an 800-degree steel barrel isn't as fun as it sounds. The wind was harder than I've ever seen, and the family was saying they've never seen it like this in at least 50 years. If you were going through a door that opened up to the outside, it required both arms to push it open. You had to protect your eyes and face, because the wind shock could freeze the water in your eyes faster than you could close them. It happened to all of us, and it was one of the worst, most indescribable pains of my life. Me and my uncle were taking turns, filling a can of gas in the barn to keep the generators running. It was the only thing keeping us alive. Frankly, the wood stoves and burning barrels were a nice addition, but that electricity was the real godsend. I felt like I was living in a different century, running around keeping everything going in shifts, wondering when it all would end. There was nothing to be done but the work at hand. Not long into the blizzard, my uncle fell and broke his leg. He was out there alone when it happened, and I didn't think to go check on him until he didn't return with the gas. I bundled up and pushed through the frost and wind until I reached that barn. I got inside and slammed the door behind me and turned to see him lying there in the mud and ice. He told me he'd yelled for a while, but realized there was no way anyone could hear him over the wind, so he just waited. I got up and found him a walking stick, helped him get back inside. Fortunately,